We thank you again for joining us this evening. Enjoy the show.
From New Hampshire Public Radio, I'm Laura Canoy, and this is The Exchange live from home. Today's show is the second in our summer virtual event series, examining the impact of COVID-19 on New Hampshire and where our state goes from here. And for the next hour, we're going to focus on personal finances of what's been happening in New Hampshire and around the nation. The pandemic has affected just about everybody's economic situation in ways large and small. Lost jobs, of course, have had a huge impact. And even for those whose jobs are secure, their financial outlook may be altered by all the uncertainty, from major decisions like whether to retire or change jobs to small daily choices like whether to go out to eat. We have two guests for our event. Russ Tebow is head of applied economic research in Laconia. Welcome, Russ. Great to have you.
Great to be here, Laura. Thank you.
And also with us, Diana Elliott, a principal research associate at the Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population at the Urban Institute. And it's good to meet you, Diana. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And I'd like to put a question out to our virtual audience right now. They are seeing a poll. What we're asking them is, since early March, when the pandemic reached New Hampshire, how has your financial situation changed? Do you feel less financially stable, more financially stable, or about the same? Our second poll question is, of the following options, which things are your biggest financial issues that you're worried about right now? Your current income, your savings and money for emergencies, your rent, mortgage, or other housing costs, everyday essentials like food, or your long-term financial stability like retirement or investments. So while the audience is filling out those poll questions, Russ, let's start with you. How different is this recession from other economic downturns that you've seen in New Hampshire? Russ, you've been watching our economy for a long time.
Yeah, well, I think this is the most peculiar downturn I've ever seen. On the one hand, the economy has taken a hit that it's never seen before. Nationally, a 32% annual drop, a rate of annual drop in GDP, unemployment rate that we've never seen before, and similarly in New Hampshire. So basically, you can say the economy has crashed, but the federal stimulus has put in a guardrail, really, in the form of $3 trillion, more or less, in stimulus money. So if you look at some of the economic indicators, on the one hand, the numbers look terrible. 14, 15% unemployment rate at its peak nationally and in New Hampshire, an 11% unemployment rate in New Hampshire, a little bit above that. For the first time I know of, and that's probably covering almost 50 years now, a higher unemployment rate in New Hampshire than the national rate, barely, but nonetheless higher. And yet, if you look at some of the other indicators, it doesn't look so bad. Home sales are rising now from their bottom. They're doing pretty good. We all know the stock market is up 50% from its trough in April. So it's really a very peculiar and unusual downturn.
It is peculiar, Russ, and I've heard you quoted saying health first, economics second. So just give us a little more there.
Yeah, absolutely. Until people are feeling confident that they can go to a restaurant and not get ill, until they can go to a movie theater and not get ill, until they can go to a hotel, until they get on an airplane and not get ill, all those things aren't going to happen. And those sectors have been hit extremely hard, which is why New Hampshire's unemployment rate is higher than the nation. We're a tourist-oriented state to a great degree. We have a lot of jobs in the restaurant industry, in lodging and accommodations. And so we really got hit hard. So until the health thing is under control nationally, and people feel that it's under control, probably in the form of a vaccine, we're really not going to get back to normal. You know, another thing to think of, Laura, and I know you're aware of this, it's taken 5 to 7 years normally to fully recover the jobs lost in a downturn. So even without the noise of the virus, when we have a downturn, we've never had one this severe, but when we have a severe downturn, it takes a long time to get back to what we call normal.
Wow. Well, Diana, how do you view it at the national level? How are Americans doing in terms of their personal finances, Diana?
Yeah, I mean, I'd second what Russ said, which it's really a peculiar downturn, right? But one of the things that I think we saw in 2008 as well is that certain segments of the population are affected more than others, right? So Although we have 33 million Americans who've been getting jobless benefits since the start, that's an extraordinarily high number. It's really disproportionately felt by Latinx and Hispanic families and Black families. I think for the first time since 1973, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics started tracking unemployment by ethnicity, Latinx employment is the highest of all racial and ethnic groups. It's around 19% in April. That's extraordinarily high. And there are people, these are families and a lot of people who can't work remotely who are affected severely. They might be in hospitality and leisure, which, as Russ underscored, if you're working in those sectors right now, you're really hard hit. So I think for some families, they're doing fine. They're working from home, and that's a challenge. They might not have childcare. But for other families, this is absolutely devastating. And when you couple the fact that a lot of people get their health care through their employment, it's really a challenging time for people.
Well, I heard just yesterday about a Mexican restaurant in Manchester that had to close because just too many employees had COVID. So there you go. Diana, what were the financial weak spots for these vulnerable families even before the pandemic hit? Was it, not enough savings? Was it poor health care? Was it a high cost of housing? What were the financial weak spots for them even before all this?
I'd say definitely housing and definitely on savings. What we see is that, over a third of Americans say that they don't have $400 in cash or credit cards to cover an unexpected emergency. So when you have a sudden job loss like this, it's absolutely devastating to a lot of families. I think, layer on that sort of the high cost of housing in so many areas. We find that, I think a Harvard study found that nearly half of renters are cost burdened. They're paying more than 30% of their income on rent. And when you sort of layer that on with high cost areas like Boston and New Hampshire and much of the Northeast, frankly, it's really hard when people lose their incomes to continue to pay their rent. And then think about the trickle down, right? That then affects landlords who have trouble paying their bills as well. So it can be terribly devastating to the whole economy.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you about, Diana. Just make the connection for us. So when one family loses a job or has hours cut, it isn't just devastating for that family. There's sort of ripple effects down the line. So go ahead, Diana.
Absolutely. So if you think about the situation of a renter, right? A renter, maybe one person in that household loses their income. They have trouble making rent. They have to decide, will I purchase food? Will I pay the rent? So they talk to their landlord and they try to negotiate maybe, paying their rent a little bit later, maybe, paying a little bit less. Maybe the landlord can do that. Maybe the landlord is willing to do that. But in some cases, landlords have to pay a mortgage as well. So they don't want to be late as well. So it's sort of this trickle effect. And then, think about childcare. In our society, a lot of people need childcare in order to work, even at home, right? It's really challenging to work when you have toddlers and whatnot. But if the childcare center is closed, you're not putting your child in childcare. And we're starting to hear stories about small family childcare centers that just can't sustain because it's not a very high profit industry. So you have now small childcare centers that are on the brink or they've closed, again, putting further risk about our future recovery in question.
Russ, make those links for us with a New Hampshire perspective, please. So again, if a family is in crisis or there's a tourism economy, for example, where you live in the Lakes region, if the tourism economy in the Lakes region goes down, if that boat rental place or that B&B on the lake can't make rent or can't pay the property taxes or is struggling, how does that go down the line?
Yeah, it's really a matter, for a while we didn't know how intense this was going to be. We now know
Right.
the downturn is intense, although it's ameliorated, mitigated by the federal contributions. But if you look at New Hampshire and let's say Maine's tourism industry, and just this week I drove from Acadia National Park to Portsmouth on Route 1, which is heavily populated with mom and pop businesses. Many of them are closed. And those businesses don't have the wherewithal to sustain a long downturn. it's looking now, some of the surveys I've seen are that 40% of the businesses that closed because of the epidemic, the small businesses, are not going to open again. There's just as the households, as Diana said, don't have a lot of cushion, financial cushion. A lot of small businesses in New Hampshire, particularly in the tourism industry, also don't have that financial cushion. So even if you asked earlier, how long will this last or what will make it different? The fact of the matter is, we're dealing with a structural change in the United States economy already as a result of this, particularly for small businesses, small retailers, and even large retailers like Neiman Marcus, J. Crew, Brooks Brothers, really, filed bankruptcy, J.C. Penney. So there's a structural change when you shut down. We've never shut down the economy. We shut it down in March, April, and as we opened it, we found that, well, maybe that was a mistake in the southern and some of the Midwestern states, because it just gave the virus a new entree into our households. So I think that what we're dealing with here is a very severe impact in New Hampshire, places like New Hampshire, because of the impact on small businesses. And as Diana said, it's lower wage sectors of the economy, and we have tons of that here in New Hampshire. We lost 100,000 jobs in New Hampshire between February and April, and we've never had that kind of a downturn anywhere near it.
Wow.
And a lot of those jobs simply are not going to come back.
Well, we did ask our virtual audience to fill out a poll for us, and they jumped on it very quickly. First, we asked, how has your financial situation changed since March? And here's what people said. 26% said they feel less financially stable. 9% said they feel more financially stable. And 66% said about the same. Diana, what do you think about that? Does that surprise you?
That rings about true with what I would expect. Again, we have sort of a group who actually has been doing okay. Again, working at home, they haven't lost their jobs. For many people, their savings have actually gone up during this period, which is an interesting sort of contrast to all of the losses that we've seen among lower income and populations where they've lost their jobs. In my experience, there's always sort of a big chunk in the middle that sort of says, I'm doing fine, even if they're not feeling okay. Or some people are just more optimistic. Other people are a bit more pessimistic about their viewpoint. But that quarter that's not doing financially well, I think that really rings true with the national data.
Well, it's interesting, too. You said some people are saving. And of course, some people are joking that, I'm not getting my hair cut, which viewers can probably see is the case with me. I'm not getting my hair cut. I was going to go on vacation. I'm not going to the movies. I'm not going out to eat. So for some folks, Diana, it sounds like they're saving money. Their personal finances are a little bit better.
Absolutely. I mean, the American savings rate is never great. We're never standouts, internationally. But the savings rate has gone up during this period. And I think it's some of the things that you said, right? There's a lot of discretionary income that's not being spent. And also there's a certain psychology about it as well. People get nervous. They get nervous about what's going on in the economy, and they want a better safety net for themselves. And for those people who have that discretionary income right now, we're starting to see signs that some of that is happening.
Well, and getting to your
Laura,
point.
may I?
Sure. Go ahead,
may I
Russ.
pipe in as well? Diana, you're absolutely on correct. But also, a lot of people are actually making more money now on unemployment than they were making when they were working. About 60% of the unemployed, and that's a result of the $600 payment, federal supplemental payment for unemployment insurance. Now, as we speak, that has ended. Presumably, something's going to come to fill the void. But for another reason why a lot of people feel pretty good may be that the supplemental income that has trickled down from Washington for the first time in memory has made their financial situation on a weekly basis actually a little bit better.
Well, and Diana, you
So
mentioned,
that may
yeah,
be part of it as well.
sure. You mentioned that people are worried, even if they haven't lost their jobs, even if their income feels stable. People have concerns. And that was our second poll question. What are the biggest financial issues you're worried about right now? So here are the results. 23% said they're worried about their current income. 23% said savings and money for emergencies. 9% said rent, mortgage, or other housing costs. And 9% said everyday essentials like food. Wow, I'm struck by that. And Russ, I'd love your thoughts too. People have a lot of economic concerns.
Well, I think it goes back to there's a lot of uncertainty about where this economy is headed. You may be okay now. You may be part of the 75% that's not feeling terrible, but you watch the news at night. You see a lot of very negative things. You worry, you see the virus surging in other parts of the country. And I think it raises concern in a lot of people's minds about the future, about going forward. Will I have enough to pay the rent? Will I have enough? The 9% for food is very disconcerting. The very basic element of survival. So uncertainty creates a great deal of confusion and a lack of confidence. Uncertainty is the enemy of confidence. So I think that's what your survey is revealing.
It's really interesting. And I do want to remind our listeners that it's our special summer series, The Exchange, live from home. And we'd like to hear from our virtual audience. Tell us what you're spending less on these days, maybe what you're spending more on. And are there any economic positives that you have seen in all this? Type your comments into the chat, and in a few minutes, we will share your stories. Diane, I'd love your thoughts too on what Russ said. We're talking this hour not just about people's current financial situations, but their outlook. And how important is people's personal financial outlook, Diana, to the broader economy? Even if they're fine, as Russ said, they may not go out and buy something.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful right now. I think there's still a lot of people for whom 2008 and the recovery is really fresh in their minds as well. And 2008, it was again a different beast entirely, but it's still fresh enough for a lot of people, and a lot of people lost a lot of wealth during that period, lost jobs. That there is a certain amount of nervousness, I think, circulating right now. But if you look at the stock market as a separate indicator, as Russ said earlier, the stock market is back to sort of levels of optimism that I think surprise many, many people right now. It is a peculiar, this is a peculiar economic beast right now. It's a little bit hard to read the tea leaves on where we're going in terms of optimism and pessimism. I think there's a lot of optimism that a vaccine will make everything return to normal. Whether that's true or not is something to be said. But there will be long-term impacts to this regardless. One of the things that Russ said earlier about sort of, small businesses closing, I think is really powerful, because then the ripple effect is that that's lost revenue then for cities and counties and small governments, right? Which then impacts many other aspects of life. So there's more to be unpacked here over time.
In terms of that financial outlook, Diana, and the uncertainty that you and Russ described, you study something called economic stability, economic mobility. What is the impact of this uncertainty on economic mobility? And why is that important?
Yeah, it's a great question. So economic mobility is the idea that you will get ahead of where your parents were, or your kids will get ahead of where you were, or at least sort of keep your place on the economic ladder. And Americans have a lot of anxiety about this. I think you see that sort of materialize in a lot of the anxiety about will my child go to college? What college will they get into? And one of the things that we saw in 2008, for example, related to paying for college and these long-term mobility enhancing investments, is that in 2008, during, just prior to that recession, parents were leveraging their home equity to pay for kids to go to college. As soon as the recession hit, you saw, a very good study shows that curtailed. that parents were no longer tapping into home equity to pay for their kids' college. Kids were then graduating with a lot of debt, and were graduating into a labor market that was not conducive to making high wages if they could find jobs at all. So I do worry a little bit about what this will do for our young generation. What will this do for their future economic outlook? Will they be able to attend college? Will they be able to finish college? Will they then come out to a labor market where they can find, a sustainable wage? I think there's a lot of questions about how economically mobile will be setting up this next generation of young adults.
All right, we are going to take a quick 30-second break. So grab a snack, stand up and stretch, or just sit back and relax because we will be right back. Welcome back to The Exchange live from home. I'm Laura Kanoy. It's the second in our summer virtual events series examining the impact of COVID-19 on New Hampshire and where our state goes from here. We're focusing on how the pandemic has affected Americans' personal finances and their financial outlook. Our guests are Russ Tebow, head of applied economic research in Laconia, and Diana Elliott, economist and principal research associate at the Urban Institute. And to our virtual listeners, I want to let you know that Russ is just with us on audio. The person you see, the other person, is our executive producer, Michael Brindley, who will be joining us later during the exchange after hours for questions that you might have about the show. So just to clear that up. And to our live audience with us, we would love to hear from you. What are you spending less on these days? What are you spending more on? Are there any economic positives that you see of all this? And you can comment on our chat right now. We would really like to hear from you. And Diana and Russ, let's go to the chat. And Mimi says, I'm a CFP, which I'm assuming is Certified Financial Planner, and have been meeting multiple times a day with people who are considering taking an early retirement package. Many people are taking the package, even though it is likely to adversely affect their overall retirement. That is so interesting. And Russ, what do you think about that? People taking early retirement, saying it's too complicated, I'm out.
I think it reflects the uncertainty. I mean, consumer confidence actually has dipped sharply in this downturn. So if you're not confident about your job going forward, but yet your retirement package looks pretty good and secure, you maybe opt for security over, even though it involves less compensation on a year-to-year basis. So I think that, for example, hospital workers, some are being asked to go on furlough or be laid off, or some are being asked to take early retirement or run the risk of being laid off. So the early retirement makes a lot more sense, I think, for those people. I think it ties back into confidence and not sure where this is going in the future. And perhaps the adage, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Diana, what do you think? I've got a friend who is a teacher, was thinking about retiring in a couple years. And after doing all the virtual learning at the end of the year last year, he said, forget it. I just don't want to do it. And he took early retirement. So I'm wondering if we're going to be hearing a lot of these stories, Diana.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll say one of the most reliable stats on retirement is that people often retire earlier than they think they will and that they plan for. So it's almost like we should start planning to retire early, even if we think we're going to work till 70. But I think it's interesting that he's a teacher, because I think there's a lot of uncertainty among teachers right now about the safety of the workplace. I read recently that about a quarter of our teachers nationwide are over the age of 65. And when you think about how that intersects with the COVID sort of risk group, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about health and is it safe to work. In terms of the virtual environment, I think that's a whole other set of criteria, right? It's a complicated it's a complicated environment to teach in, but
What about
it's interesting.
what about Diana, people making the flip decision, staying later in the workforce than they wanted to because they're worried about their finances or they can't afford now because maybe their partner or spouse has lost a job. I'm wondering if you're seeing that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a factor as well, right? Yeah, on the flip side, you have people who realize that they can't retire because they don't have enough money to pay the bills. And I think we saw a bit of that in the '08 recession. And you're starting to hear some anecdotal stories about that now, but it will be interesting to see what happens long term.
On the chat, we've got a couple comments from people, relating to what you said earlier, Russ, about people just not wanting to venture out. And that's going to be what it takes to get some of these businesses back. Janet says it's too scary to travel, too scary to spend because of all the unknowns. Another person says movie theaters closed, small gift stores going to internet sales, places disappearing locally. Will they come back? You touched on that earlier, Russ, but go ahead. I think there is a sense of people feeling like, well, once there's a vaccine and everything's safe again, everything will come back. But you said earlier, not necessarily. So go ahead, Russ.
Well, certainly not until we have a reliable vaccine that people have confidence in. Will things like the airlines, which are running an 80-90% decline in travel volume, restaurants running 60-70-80% decline in activity, that's not going to come back really back to where it was until that vaccine is in place, its efficacy is proven. So we've got a long wait here, I think. We're certainly nowhere near close to being at that back to normal yet. I thought personally that this would be like many viruses and flus, that once the summer came, it would subside with seasonal and maybe bounce back in the fall, and maybe we'd be better equipped to deal with it. But it's just blowing right through the summer months.
Yeah.
So it's very disconcerting.
Well, again, to our live virtual audience, join us on the chat. Tell us how you're reacting economically, your own personal financial situation, and what sorts of financial decisions you're making. What are you spending more on? What are you holding back on? What are the biggest economic positives out of this, perhaps, for you? And the biggest economic negatives. We'd love to share your stories. So go into the chat and talk to us about that. A couple more comments. Bridget says food costs have gone up at the store. We are also spending more on takeout to support local businesses, and I am still working. Bridget, I'm glad you're still working. What about support for local businesses, Russ? I have heard some local businesses say, they feel a commitment from their communities. They feel people here in New Hampshire kind of showing them the love. So what are you hearing?
Well, yeah, I think that that's definitely a factor for some households, but unfortunately, they're the minority house. They're the minority of households, not minority households, but they're not. It's not the common. So you do see grocery store sales up, restaurant sales tanking. So people are eating at home more. Restaurants are doing a great job with takeout, conventional restaurants. We've done it. It's very convenient, very well done. But still, all in all, I think that what you're seeing is that there's been a transfer of spending, just as a transfer of spending from brick and mortar facility retailers to online retailers. Amazon's gone crazy. There's been a transfer of food spending from conventional sit-down restaurants to grocery stores.
Here's another comment on the chat. Sophia says, I do not go to restaurants. I do not get manicures and pedicures. I try not to drive much to save on gas, and vacation is out for now. Thank you, Sophia, for writing in. What do you think about that, Diana? People cutting back on those little personal services, and, it's not that painful for Sophia, but for the person who used to do her manicure, it is painful.
That's right. That's right. Sort of what we were talking about earlier is the mom and pop businesses who may really take a hit. And as Russ said, they might not come back. But I think a lot of people are cutting back on some of those discretionary pieces, whether they want to or not. I think we're in a situation where, in a sense, we're forced to because of the health and safety risks. So again, it's some of those families will then have a bit more money set aside.
It gets back to what you said earlier, Diana. Some people are really struggling. Some people find They are saving a little bit more because they're just not spending on vacations, manicures, pedicures, and so forth.
Yep, exactly.
Here's another comment from the chat. Rachel says the optimism is from wealthy people or from people who have not lost their jobs. That may be why the stock market is reacting the way it is. In 2008, 2009, the market spoke volumes. Russ, let's talk more about that. I was surprised to hear you say that the stock market is going gangbusters. My first thought was, why? So go ahead.
No, my first thought was, why not me? You know, I think that what we have here is really bifurcated downturn. There are a number of households that can work at home, workers that can work at home. I mean, it's very disconcerting and whatnot. You may miss the socialization of the office, but you can get by. And so for upper middle, white collar, office type workers, it hasn't been that big a hit. Witness the housing market. We haven't talked about housing. Housing in New Hampshire, we have an all-time low inventory. Home prices are higher than they were last year at this time, a lot higher than they were when the epidemic began. Housing construction is bouncing back nationally. In a normal downturn, we lose 20-25% of housing value. That's not happening this time around. And I think the reason why, Diana's spoken to it very well, that a lot of the pain is concentrated in lower wage jobs that don't have a big aren't big players in the for sale housing market. Now, if you flip over the renter market here in New Hampshire, we have now about a 2% unemployment rate. We have a moratorium on evictions. There's a lot of concern going forward about whether those low and moderate income households, especially if they lose the supplemental unemployment, $600 a week, whether they're going to be able to continue to pay rent and stay in their housing. So that's a big concern going forward. So I think the housing market reflects the bifurcation of this downturn. It's bipolar. Some are doing okay. Some are very depressed.
Well, keep the chat going. We want to hear your comments, your financial situation, what you might be spending more on, what you might be spending less on, and if there are any economic positives out of all this for you. We really want to hear from you. So go into the chat and let us know. Diana, I'd like to hear from you too, the connection between the stock market and this economic picture that we're talking about, this personal financial picture that we're talking about, because sometimes it does seem disconnected.
Absolutely. I mean, Russ, with discussion of bifurcation, I think that's what we've been seeing for a long time in our economy. And I feel like this point in time has only exaggerated that bifurcation. You have some people that have, substantial retirement accounts and other people who are worried about how they're going to pay for retirement or don't have any money at all in retirement, don't have emergency savings. So this very bifurcated economic condition. I'm really struck by some research I did a few years ago, maybe 2014, 2015, where I talked to different groups and they were set differently by income. And the upper income group, they were worried about their stock portfolios. That was their big financial worry. In the middle income and the lower income groups that I talked to, they were doing amazing sort of mental acrobatics, trying to figure out how to stage their bills to pay their bills, because there's just not enough money every month to pay the bills. So it really reflects this very different economic experience that we have in this country.
Wow. Well, more from the chat. Bridget says, my son manages Wings It in Dover, and they have had tremendous business throughout this whole thing. They went to takeout only right away, and a lot of places just closed. Russ, some restaurants in this pandemic have done very well. Takeout, delivery, they've been pretty busy. What have you seen?
Yeah, I think that some are doing a great job with the whole takeout phenomenon online, and particularly through online marketing. And they have a particular niche that people respond to and are anxious to get back and kind of get out of the kitchen for a change. Brings a little variety into a lifestyle that we're in now that has almost no variety, no new people, no new places, at least some new food once in a while.
Some wings from Dover.
So, Yeah, even in Dover, everywhere. So, no traveling, no getting on an airplane. Maybe in our case, no visiting our grandchildren in Massachusetts. So, any kind of variety you can kind of garner is helpful. And I think the restaurants, some are doing a great job, others not so great. I think it's more a dinner hour thing than a lunch and breakfast thing. Obviously, takeout breakfast is not. Uh, going to happen. So it kind of depends on the menu, and you know, a, a, a solid middle income appealing dinner menu is going to do okay. A luncheon, strong luncheon, breakfast, not so well.
Yeah. Well, we ourselves early in the pandemic said, okay, we're tired of cooking. So every Friday night we try to order
There
from
you go.
a local Concord place, just to support the local restaurant community and also to give us a break from all the cooking. Not that we mind cooking, but it's a lot. So it's really good to get that comment. Um, a couple of questions for both of you about policy choices. And Diana, you touched on this earlier, but I'd like a little bit more. What policy choices do you see, Diana, at the national level affecting the day to day financial decisions that Americans are making?
Yeah, I think Russ talked about this earlier, but the extra $600 that families were getting on top of sort of their unemployment claims was really important, right? So, as he said, this was often higher than what some people were receiving at their workplaces, and the early evidence shows that this has kept a lot of people out of poverty. That when you model this out, I have a colleague who's modeled this out for families through the end of December. It could actually improve poverty rates, especially among Black and Hispanic families in this country, because minimum wage jobs in a lot of parts of the country don't pay a lot. So that has been a very important policy lever. I'm a little concerned that there hasn't been any traction. This expired on July 31st. There hasn't been any traction on getting something else in its place. And that has been something that has been very important for families, for maintaining stability. I'm particularly concerned that we're facing an eviction tsunami. It's great that in New Hampshire you have a moratorium right now. In other parts of the country, that's not the case. And without that supplemental money, you're going to have a lot of people who will be displaced and with nowhere to go.
Yeah, we did a whole program on the
Along that
evictions crisis.
line,
Yeah, go ahead,
if I
Russ.
may,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you. I'm sorry because you can't see me. I don't mean to talk over either one of you. Um, but I did the math, and it's about $180 million a year a month into the New Hampshire economy. The $600 premium. There are a lot of employers that are complaining that we can't hire people because they can make more money on unemployment. And the fact of the matter is that if you take that $600 a week out of the state's economy, if you take the $180 million a month out of the state's economy, a lot of those employers that are complaining are not going to be in business anymore because there's people aren't going to have enough money to support them. So there's sort of a two-edged sword there, even in terms of the employers that are a little bit frustrated by, if you're getting 600 a week from the federal government, maybe 300 from the state government, you're getting close to $1,000 a week, the equivalent of 50,000 a year. That's pretty good. And that's what underlies a lot of the fact that the savings rate has gone up, credit card debt is going down, housing market's doing pretty good, the rental markets, we haven't seen a wave of the evictions that Diana is rightfully concerned about, pending evictions. So that's a really big deal. And I agree with her. I think it would be devastating to the state's economy if there's not a substantial replacement of that $600 a week. We shut down the economy. These people need help.
Well, listeners are still weighing in on the chat, so continue to do so. Lori says $600 a week equates to $15 an hour, a living wage. This crisis illustrates that, Lori says. At this point, we need to take a very short 30-second break, so stand up, stretch, grab a drink, or sit back and relax, and we will be right back. Welcome back to the Exchange Live from Home. I'm Laura Kanoy. It's the second in our special virtual event series examining the impact of COVID-19 on New Hampshire and where our state goes from here. We're focusing on personal finances, how the pandemic has affected Americans' financial health, and just as important, their financial outlook, the decisions we're making about money now and in the future. Our guests are Russ Tebow, Head of Applied Economic Research in Laconia, and Diana Elliott, Principal Research Associate at the Urban Institute. And both of you, let's go back to our chat. We have been asking our virtual audience to weigh in there, what you're spending more on, what you might be spending less on, whether you see any economic positives out of the situation that we're in. Again, go to the chat and write your comments there, and we'd love to share your stories. Mary Lou says, New Hampshire relies on property taxes. What will happen when these payments cannot be made? And Russ, I'm going to throw that to you because you are the New Hampshire economist.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I've been looking for an opening to talk about that issue because it's very significant. Office space is emptying out because everybody's working at home. I have a friend that works at home and she said, gee, I really miss the socialization of the office. So I'm going in. I went in yesterday, and when I went in, there was no one there to socialize with because they all prefer to work at home. So then if you look at retailing, our malls in Nashua, Manchester, Lebanon, Portsmouth, Newington, they're empty. So our non-residential tax base is getting whacked right now. And that's eventually going to filter into the local tax rate. Now, residential property values are holding up, but to offset the declining values that we're seeing and likely to see in the non-residential part of our tax base, in this state that is extremely dependent on the property tax, we're going to have to raise property taxes on residential properties, even if they hold value. More so if eventually this thing turns into another, as all of our recessions have turned into around a 20% downturn in real estate values. This one that's part of the anomaly here. But I think it has a significant impact on property tax. Here's another weird impact that I hadn't thought of. A friend of mine called me. He's consulting to the town of Plymouth. Plymouth State University is all but shut down. They're one of the biggest users, and they're one of the biggest users of the sewer system. When there's no water flowing into the sewer system, there's no revenue flowing in to pay off the debt. So there's really insidious impacts on municipal finance that are emerging that are very troublesome in our state that's so heavily dependent on local services paid for with local property taxes?
Well, it's a great question because it does trickle down to all sorts of, as you said, local services, Russ, schools and so on. Can you explain to me, Russ? I feel like I heard that home values were actually up, while, as you said, commercial property values are going down because people are working from home and not going to, businesses and restaurants. Is that true here in New Hampshire, Russ? And if so, why would that be the case?
Absolutely. One of the reasons why housing is doing, first of all, the office space in the non-residential is declining because people are working at home or
Right.
not going shopping.
Sure.
So they're kind of disconnected rationales. Then the housing side is doing pretty well because we have record low unemployment rates, and we have a lot of people that are able to work at home, earn the same income, and the difference between a 2.5% mortgage rate and a 4.5% mortgage rate is substantial in the monthly payments. So housing is more affordable now because of the low interest rates than it was before. Now, some people are shut out of the market, to be sure, but many people are able to play in this market and do pretty well in it.
Wait, I'm confused. So
different reasons.
You said the housing market is doing well, Russ, because we have record low unemployment rates?
No, I'm sorry. If I said I'm sorry. Record low interest rates.
Mortgage rates. Yes.
Yeah.
They have been
Record
almost
low mortgage rates.
They have been almost on the floor.
Versus 3.5%. And the very high unemployment rate is really concentrated among lower wage workers who aren't necessarily players in the for sale housing market to begin with. So the lower interest rates are helping out housing. Higher vacancy rates, people working at home are hurting non-residential properties.
Someone else on the chat relates to this, saying rooms and meals taxes are taking another big hit, but residential taxes are already crazy. Time to rethink how we fund this state. I'd like to hear from you too, Diana, on the sort of, we keep using the word bifurcated, but there is a bifurcated real estate market, commercial kind of tanking and residential seeming to do okay. What are you seeing nationally?
So I know a little bit less about that nationally, I have to confess. But I can pick up a thread that Russ was talking about earlier and how this has implications for our governments and how we fund our governments. I had done some research just this past year on the cost of financial insecurity to various cities. And it is extremely costly when you have families who are unable to pay their property taxes, who are evicted, and then homeless services have to be paid for, who can't pay their utility bills. In some cities, like in Chicago, we estimated this was, like between 68 and 157 million dollars a year. So you can only imagine that it would be on that sort of magnitude for the whole state of New Hampshire as well. That is a huge loss of revenue. It's absolutely in the state's best interest to have financially healthy and financially secure residents who can pay those taxes. And I think it's really interesting that there's a loss in potential revenue because of universities not using the water services. I think that's just yet another ancillary sort of effect that we might see in this economy.
That's really getting down to the micro level, and that's a really interesting story that shows you just how much the ripple effects are there. Nick on the chat says we are retirees on a fixed income, saving much more now because we don't eat out, we don't get haircuts, keep food portions low so we don't have to shop more than every 2 or 3 weeks. We don't use doggy daycare, we don't pay for luxuries like massage. So this gets back to something both of you have said earlier. Some people are managing to sock more money away because they're just not really going out or going to the theater, going to the movies, or spending money on those little necessities. And again, Russ, while that's great for some people like Nick to save money, put a little money in their pockets because they're not spending on it, there's local repercussions to those decisions. The people who provide the doggy daycare, for example.
Exactly. It's, to say I'm on a fixed income, I say, thank God, thank yourself, thank God you are in this kind of a economic situation. People have changed their spending patterns, not just the elderly, but across the board. The personal savings rate, as Diane said, has actually climbed during this downturn, and credit card debt has fallen. People are using some of this windfall, you might call it, or they're shifting their spending from discretionary items. They're just not buying the discretionary items, not getting on an airplane, not going to a hotel, vacationing close to home, if at all, and not going to restaurants. So there's a shift in consumer spending that is across a broad front, creating some winners. I think very few winners, in fact. Mostly online retailers. You talked, Laura, about some of the restaurants doing okay, but a lot more losers than winners.
On the personal finance level, Diane, I'll throw this to you first. What should individuals be thinking about right now to try to keep themselves in financially decent shape for the near future? Obviously, we've all learned there's so much we can't control, but as much as we can control it, what should we be thinking about now? What should our outlook or our perspective be?
Well, I think that people are saving more is a good thing. Americans are not generally great savers, so the fact that the savings rate has gone up a little bit, I think, is really important. And the more that people can sort of count on an unexpected expense. A few years ago, I worked on a survey where we found that 60% of Americans had had a financial shock in the year prior, and that included death, it included divorce, it included job loss. So the fact that unexpected expenses are really expected should suggest that more people put money aside and get that ship right in the meantime. I think to Russ's point about credit card debt going down, that's a really positive thing for people's finances too, because potentially their credit scores will go up, which will improve their ability to borrow once they're comfortable and want to borrow in the future. So I think that's a positive as well.
So it seems like you're saying, Diana, Americans' financial approach toward life or philosophy toward life might be a little more cautious or conservative once we come out of this.
This feels more sustainable, truthfully. I've often looked at the data and have been concerned that not enough people can cover unexpected expenses. But again, I think this goes back to that bifurcation that we were talking about earlier, where there's a group of Americans who cannot save because all of their money goes out the door to pay bills every month. And it's that group that I personally worry about the most, especially in this situation, because they're the ones who are taking the biggest job losses. They're the ones who aren't necessarily going to be saved, and their wealth and security could be hampered for years after.
Yeah, those lower wage jobs that were
I-
lost in hospitality. Go ahead, Russ. Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry, Laura.
it's okay. Go
It's a
ahead.
bad habit of mine. Uh, I'm sure Diana knows this as well. It's really hard on young people, young households that are just out of college, maybe trying to get their first job. Relatively few people are hiring because of the uncertainty. They're the ones that work in restaurants for the most part. They're the ones that work in the lodging industry. So while we have the minority population that's hit harder, also the young demographic is hit much harder in this weirdo downturn that we're in.
Well, we've got two comments on the chat from people on the older end of the spectrum. Sean says retirees and those on disability are also significantly affected. No extra $600 a week for them above their monthly benefit. Sean says, my 78-year-old mom is on a very tight budget with more than 50% of Social Security income going to rent. Wow, 50%. Another person wrote on the chat, when one has only average or less than average Social Security checks, that does not help with lower spending. You have to use savings to augment Social Security inadequate monthly checks. What can you tell us about this, Diana, how people on those meager fixed incomes have been doing during this pandemic?
Yeah, I think that startling, sort of fact of spending 50% or more on rent. I think that that's terribly startling. But unfortunately, it's a significant chunk of renters in high cost areas spend that much on their housing. So in the Northeast, that's a little bit more typical than I think we would prefer. There's a lot of people, I think it's about a third of renters are sort of in that low income renters are in that severely cost burdened bracket. In fact, I think I looked it up for Boston in prep for this conversation, and about nearly 8 in 10 low income renters in Boston are paying 50% or more of their income on rent. So if you think about that as sort of a proxy for many places in the Northeast, it's very costly to cover rent on a fixed income and a low fixed income at that.
I want to
That's
ask.
been a
Yeah, go
long-term
ahead, Russ.
problem here in New Hampshire, Diana, as well. Overpayment more than 30%, extreme overpayment more than 50% of your income on rent. It leaves nothing for essentially for health care, auto insurance. You're already starting with almost no money. And then you've got to fork over that sizable chunk of it for mandatory rent payments. It's really severe. And we're not really doing a lot to address that. And so a lot of the jobs that have been added in New Hampshire have been lower wage jobs. So it's exacerbated the problem. And now when you have those low moderate income people losing their jobs and maybe losing that supplemental benefit, at least for this week, it's worrisome.
Russ, I want to start with you on this, but hear from you too, Diana. What is the economic uncertainty that we talked about earlier? This personal financial pulling back by a lot of people because they're just not certain. And as many have said, there's nowhere to go if you wanted to go out to see a show or on vacation. What does that uncertainty, Russ, do to wage growth, which before the pandemic was starting to tick up?
Right. Well, when you have an 11% unemployment rate, the first thought is getting a job. And we do have an 11% unemployment rate in New Hampshire, down from 14. The first thought is getting a job. What it tended to do in the last downturn, and I'm sure Diana tracked some of these numbers, is it really stretched out the time before wages started to grow the way you would expect them to as the economy improved. I think we were, as you pointed out, Laura, we were just crawling out of this low wage growth environment. We're just starting to show some decent figures. And now this happens. Just as you thought it was safe to go back in the water, the shark fin shows up. So I think that it's going to be very hard for us to see rapidly increasing wages over and above the rate of inflation. That's maybe one positive thing is inflation is extremely low, maybe even going negative, which is worrisome. So inflation's not high, but wage growth, I think it's a secondary concern to having a job almost at this point.
Wow, that's really interesting. That's a whole subject for a whole nother show, Russ. But because
The big ouch.
wow, because consumer spending is so low, inflation is going almost to negative?
It's almost negative, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's because there's no purchasing pressure on almost any aspect of the economy.
Interesting. Well, wages to you too, Diana. For a long time, as I'm sure you know, coming out of the recession, wages were stagnant for a long, long time, but they were starting to creep back up. What does this do to that wage growth?
Yeah, I've thought about that a little. I think it hampers the wage growth potentially, which is really disappointing because, as you said, it took a really long time. There was really a lag between these very low unemployment rates and increases in wages, which you might have expected sooner. I'll say the one difference between this downturn and the previous downturn is that people were much more locked to geography previously, and they theorized that that was one of the things preventing wage growth in the last downturn. With people, but because people were underwater on their homes, they didn't feel like they could lose their homes in the last downturn. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in the aftermath of this recession, because it's not as tied to the housing market. So you might have people who are more willing to move for a job elsewhere.
Oh, that's interesting. And that gets into your research again about economic mobility, why that's important to go out and find that maybe better job in another place. You've piqued my imagination. Diana, tell me a little bit more about that. I would have
Yeah.
assumed, incorrectly, I guess, that people weren't feeling very mobile right now because of the pandemic.
So, if the housing supply is low and there's lots of eager buyers, I think you're starting to see people thinking about this as an opportune moment. Again, there are people who have the means and the abilities to relocate. But in the past, in 2008, so many people were underwater on their mortgages, they just couldn't relocate.
Oh, that's
But
interesting.
studies have shown, at least in terms of economic mobility, the most economically mobile people in terms of getting ahead of their peers in terms of income are the ones who leave, potentially their state to relocate to another state for job opportunities.
Well,
So there is something to that.
and now, of course, we hear from people that everybody's working online. So we talked to someone who runs a music school who had recently hired a teacher from, halfway across the country, hired a music teacher from Spain because they're just doing everything online. So that's another issue for you to look into, Diana, huh? People working online and being hired by companies all over the world.
Absolutely. And I can tell you anecdotally, among my friends and colleagues here in Washington, D.C., this is a very high cost city. So if people can think about relocating to a lower cost area of the country, it's very appealing, and doing their job virtually. That's incredibly appealing.
Russ, for those who have lost their jobs, how much does that affect their earning potential, their wages, when they are eventually re-employed?
Yeah, it depends on the skill level primarily. But if you look at the industries that we lost, I think about 80% of the jobs we lost were in the food service and accommodation industries and retail here in New Hampshire. So I think those positions are already at the bottom of the food chain, wage wise, and they're going to stay there for the most part. So I don't think that it's going to have a dramatic impact on the ability of people to realize in and of itself higher wages, especially when if in fact, now I think I mentioned earlier that 40% of the businesses that closed are closed, period, small businesses. They didn't close temporarily because of the virus. As of now, they've been surveyed. They said, no, no, I'm not going back. I'm done. So a lot of those small business jobs are gone. The business is gone. So it's going to be a very competitive labor market. It is now. And when this comes back, it's not going to be a high bounce. It's going to be a dribble,
All right.
I think.
That was Russ Tebow, head of applied economic research in Laconia, and Diana Elliott, principal research associate at the Urban Institute. And now, live audience, stay tuned. We're going to take a quick break to bring our executive producer, Michael Brindley, into the conversation for our special after show, the After Exchange. We're going to answer some questions that we maybe didn't get to during the hour. And if you have any questions for me or Michael or our panelists about this event, you can post them now in the chat. I'm going to give some quick thank yous before we do that. Our team here at the Exchange live from home is led by producer Christina Phillips, along with engineer Dan Colgan, executive producer Michael Brindley, and Dan Toohey running the cameras. Patricia McLaughlin is our director of marketing and communications, and the engineering team is RJ Perkins and Randy Woods. Tim Brady is in charge of corporate support, and the wonderful graphics and designs you saw tonight are by Sarah Plord. This is the Exchange live from home. I'm Laura Canoy. And live audience will be right back. And we're back, and joining us is Executive Exchange producer Michael Brindley, and we're going to answer some questions that we didn't get into the hour. And virtual audience, if you have questions for me or Michael or our guests, so feel free to put them in the chat now. That is still active, so put your questions in the chat now. We'd love to hear from you. And Diana and Russ, I have a couple more questions that we didn't get to during our regular hour, maybe a little more casual than what we had during the show. To you first, I think, Russ, what kind of conversations are you having right now with your own friends and family around this? You know, the financial choices that they're making and that you hear them wrestling with. Russ, what are you hearing?
Really, summertime is vacation time. My children have our grandchildren, and for the most part, they're staying home. One of my sons and their grandchildren typically vacation in Maine for a week in the summertime. You know, Maine has this virtual moratorium on people from Massachusetts because of the virus, so they're basically staying home instead. I think curtailment of dining out, of course, nobody's eating out. Ordering pizza, a little more common. Take home pizza, seeing more of that. But vacation is, I think, one of the things that's noticeable to me that stands out, foregoing vacation time away from home. Buying a basketball hoop and putting it up in the driveway for exercise. Jogging rather than going to the gym. It's a lot of minor modifications. None of them have lost a job in this downturn. There's concern. I have a daughter-in-law who's a teacher. It's going to be an interesting year for her going
Sure.
forward. You know, so it's more, in speaking personally, I think more tweaking than dramatic changes. We don't have workers in that hard hit demographic and economic part of the economy.
How about you, Diana? What do you hear sort of your family circle or social circle kind of wrestling with? You know, should I change jobs? Should I retire early? Should I stay the course with the job I'm in? Should I buy a basketball hoop? What are you hearing from friends and family, Diana, about these personal
Yeah,
economic choices?
I think like Russ, I'm very lucky. My family's very lucky. We have not been affected. We're not necessarily in the groups or working in the sectors that are most affected. I will say my sister-in-law in Massachusetts did lose her job, and but she believes that it's temporary. So there's that optimism that once things pick up again, she will be reemployed, and you see that in the national figures as well. That people are optimistic that they'll be reemployed. Um, I think one of the things personally that people in my circle are grappling with, because I have a 17-year-old and he's a senior in high school, and everyone we know is thinking about college. Sending your child to college in this environment is really scary for a lot of people. And is it worth the expense if it's going to be virtual learning? And I think it's really hard because a lot of the colleges need the revenue as well. So it's this really tough, situation where people are weighing, what's best for my child, and also college costs a lot. So,
Right.
do we proceed ahead as usual?
Should we just go to a much less expensive school if he's going to be online? He's not getting the cool social
Uh,
experiences or the cultural experiences. And so why pay top dollar for that? That's another
Laura, I have
financial thing.
another,
Right.
another,
Go ahead,
excuse
Russ.
me, go ahead, Diana. Were you gonna say more, Diana? Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh, well, I was gonna say, I have, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Um, I have a son, daughter-in-law, who received the $1,200 each from the government in April, and they have two children, $500 each. That's $3,400 as a windfall. And they're both musicians, and they're using it to record a new CD
Oh,
at a
wow.
professional studio. Yeah. So in their case, there was this, we've talked about the $600, but we haven't talked about this lump sum payment that uh, some households received. In their case, it was $3,400 kaboom in, I think it was April, maybe May. And so they're using it to do something new with it that they feel will generate some long term benefit.
Wow, they're musicians, Russ. So hang on. Is that their full-time job or a hobby?
No, but almost they'd like it to be. I think
Yeah.
they are professionals. They do play out, and this is something been very hard on musicians because
Well,
all the
exactly.
places that you play are closed.
Right. So how have
So
they been able to make it work with that?
they just been doing without. She plays. She's African and plays in a group that goes, get this, to schools and does sort of educational programming of African music in schools. Of course, the schools are closed, so that's been another impact that's
Mm.
somewhat anecdotal.
Boy, just ripple effect after ripple effect after ripple effect for
Right.
sure. Diana, are people coming to you for advice because you are an economist? You're not a personal financial planner, but are they coming to you and saying, you know, what should I do? Should I invest in the stock market? Should I buy a house? I mean, are they asking you these questions?
That hasn't been my experience. I think because I study this from a very 30,000 foot level. I
Right.
think not so much. I do think the one area where I have strong opinions on is on credit, and that's where I think the data are really strong that it's a really achievable area for people to make improvements. And when I've done focus groups and interviews among low and middle income families, that's an area where they feel, they're able to look at their credit score through things like Credit Karma. Credit Karma might not be exactly what their credit score is, but it's a metric that they can plug into. They can take steps to kind of make changes to their credit health, and they feel really good about that. So, if that's one area that's really achievable for people to kind of monitor and make progress on, that's a good thing.
Well, you said a couple times tonight, Diana, that, one financial positive is that people who still have jobs are saving more because they're just not spending money on, again, going out and so forth. What do you think, Diana? How are the financial choices that people are making different depending on their age? You mentioned the college end, so people are wrestling with that. And then we talked about other people who are trying to figure out what to do about retirement. So, what different choices do you see based on where people are just demographically? And you can answer
Yeah,
this just personally. You don't have to give us, the official economist answer.
I think personally, I've been surprised at the number of people around me who are talking about moving, honestly.
Really?
Yeah, who can do their work virtually. They think their workplaces are going to go 100% virtual anyway. So they want to live in a lower cost area, or maybe an area where it feels like it's easier to raise a family. So I've found that to be really interesting, sort of an interesting phenomenon. I know of at least 2 instances of people who are selling their homes and relocating fully to another area. So I think it's given people the opportunity to take a pause and reevaluate. If my work's going to be virtually, I don't necessarily need to be tied to a location. I think it's going to be interesting to see how workplaces respond, right? Because it's clear that it's working to some degree for some workplaces. So will we have more workplaces like Silicon Valley tech firms who are going virtual for the next year? Will they go permanently virtual? Is this a trend that we'll start to see?
That's really interesting. And Russ, that may be an impact on New Hampshire because we don't have big cities. We are seen as sort of, clean and safe in terms of the virus. A beautiful place to live for sure. I love getting outdoors in New Hampshire. What do you think, Russ? What is the impact of those financial decisions by people in New York and Boston and DC? Are a bunch of people going to move to New Hampshire out of this?
Anecdotally, I have a friend whose son works in Manhattan for one of the large banks. And he's paying $5,500 a month for an efficiency apartment. He called his dad and said, find me a place in New Hampshire. I only need to go into JP Morgan twice a month and I can get there by bus. So I want to move to New Hampshire, live in New Hampshire for the reasons you cited, Laura, which is lifestyle, the great outdoors, the ocean, the mountains, the lakes, but also housing costs. For $5,500, you can get a lot more housing in New Hampshire than you can in Boston, in New York, and which says to me that our second home settings here in the Lakes region, where about 30% of the housing units are second homes now, I think we'll see more of those converting to year-round occupancy, hopefully help to balance out some of our demographics, bring young people who have been missing from this state back into the state from places like Boston, because as Diana mentioned, you can do it if you're working virtually. And that was his point. If I'm going to be working out of my house, why work out of a $5,500 efficiency in South Manhattan? I'll work out of a house in New Hampshire that's more sizable and a more welcoming setting.
Well, and if the appeal of Manhattan
is a positive impact on New Hampshire's housing market, and potentially a positive impact on our distorted demographic profile, which is, the oldest or nearly oldest state in the country.
Well, I want to actually bring our executive producer, Michael Brinley, in because he's been helping out tonight. Producer Christina Phillips put this whole show together, but Michael is standing by as well. And Michael, a little bit about tonight. Now, you help us work on our regular exchange show live every morning from 9 o'clock. What's been different for you about these virtual events? This is the second in our series, and we've got 2 more to go.
Well, I'd say the chat here has been really great. I mean, watching people kind of go back and forth and interact and add to points that you bring up in real time has been really interesting to watch. They'll actually respond to a comment you made to their comment and add to it. And so it's really been kind of really back and forth in terms of the engagement. So I've been really excited to see that. And the guests were great. And I thought it was a fantastic topic. And I was happy to see the engagement.
Yeah. So what special considerations, Michael, had to come into play tonight?
As far as getting the show together, I mean,
yes.
Certainly we wanted to get Russ on the video screen. We were trying to work through that in the last few minutes, but we decided we just had to make a decision and go for having him just audio, which I think was great because we had him in the conversation and would have missed having him here, obviously. So those are the things you have to work through as you get ready for a live broadcast, even virtual event. So we kind of had to troubleshoot that and made it work, and I'm glad we had Russ with us.
And power outages.
My apologies for the technical
Oh, it's
glitch.
fine. It happens. But it was a great conversation. It worked out. And of course, in the middle of this storm, of course, people are dealing with all sorts of things. So lots to deal with, but it worked out okay.
Well, we have a backup generator here at NHPR, but I think we were concerned, right, Michael, that a lot of viewers and listeners' power would go out.
Yeah, we had some conversation about whether, this, to move forward. We ended up wanting to do it, and I think it was the right decision.
And to our
Well, I've always said I have a face made for radio.
So to our regular show, Michael, that we work on together, we've been covering the pandemic just about every day, in addition to the sort of national reckoning on race that America is going through right now. Those have been the two topics that have basically occupied us since March. As these huge shifts in our society and our culture, Michael, sort of move into their 5th, 6th, probably 7th, 8th, 9th month, what do you hear listeners really wanting to focus on now? This is not new anymore.
Yeah, I think what I get a sense is that, they're looking for a balance and not just, COVID all the time, which we obviously had to cover, many aspects of this, the health aspects, bringing on state health, health officials, talking about school reopening. We'll be talking about that a lot more in the coming weeks. But I think they're looking for a balance of that plus, life that's happening beyond that. Our summer book show that we had in over the past month generated a lot of engagement. Just what can I read? So it wasn't just, it's not, I think we need to make sure that each week we're presenting a variety of topics that people can feel like they're getting, not just the doom and gloom stuff, which we got to cover what's happening and people are engaging with that. But I think we need to offer a balance as well.
Yeah, we did a program yesterday or the day before on Hannah Duston and the statue and the story of Hannah Duston and how it's controversial and how people are looking at it again, given that Confederate statues are being, torn down and re-examined. So, boy, we got a lot of audience
Yeah, that was amazing to see the engagement there.
Yeah,
and
that
today,
was great.
Diversifying the Outdoors, great show, a lot of engagement. Next week, we'll be talking about the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage and, everything that comes along with that, the history. So we're trying to balance it out, make sure that we're touching on the topics that need to be touched on, school reopening, health issues, but making sure we present a balanced programming.
Right. And, just a promotion, you mentioned the summer book show tomorrow. We are going to be playing that back tomorrow because your host has worked about 14 or 15 hours today. So she would like to rest a little bit tomorrow. And also, as you said, Michael, it was a great show. People loved it. So we'll play it back for you. Last question for our guests. And Russ, to you first. Is there anything else that you want people to think about as they just think about this topic of personal finance in a pandemic?
I guess I would say that the low confidence level about the future, that the future is uncertain, more uncertain now than it has been virtually in memory. It's very hard. I mean, in January, I was saying this is a great economy. We have a low unemployment rate, low inflation rate, decent economic growth. Everything's great. That was the 3rd week in January.
I remember that.
Later, yeah, I know. And a month later, everything was falling apart.
Right.
So the swings in this economy are extreme. I would just advise people to not do anything crazy, to hang on, observe what's going on. I find myself, and Diana's probably the same, as an economist, it used to be I would have to look carefully at stuff about every other week or every month. Now it's every day, because every day brings something dramatically different. So I would just advise people to hang on, don't do anything crazy, be careful. We don't know what tomorrow holds.
Yeah. Well, Diana, how about you? Any just last thoughts that you are thinking about as we look at Americans' personal financial situations and their personal financial outlook? Because as we talked earlier, outlook is really important.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm struck by is that in recent years, we've seen that people really want financial security. And Americans don't have an outlandish idea of what financial security is. It's being able to pay the bills, maybe having a little bit of extra for takeout, for restaurants, for vacations. And that really rings true across all families and households. So to the extent that we emerge from this with sort of a deeper appreciation for that modest view of financial security and have policy help and intervene to make families who aren't secure right now more secure with supplemental income or with supports, I think we'll come out of this on the other side with a newfound appreciation. That's my hope. We can't see the future, but I would hope that we have that appreciation for what security looks like.
Well, I'm really glad you closed out our conversation, Diane, on a hopeful note. Definitely welcome in these times. And that is all the time we have for today. Thank you to everybody who joined this virtual event. Remember, we'll air the audio from tonight this Thursday at 9 a.m., our regular time slot. You can find all the information for all of our upcoming virtual events at nhpr.org/exchange. Our next virtual event takes place Tuesday, August 18th. And the question we're going to ask is, how are you as a family managing in these times? Again, that's Tuesday, August 18th. So see you then, everybody. This is The Exchange, live from home.